session. We are very excited to have this panel here to talk really about process-based mitigation standards for improving mitigation. And this is a little bit more nerdy, sciencey policy rather than the business end of it, but it all kind of weaves together. So I am Lucy Harrington. I'm with GEI, and I'm just going to go through a quick panel introduction now so I don't forget later. I am very honored to be joined by a great panel of academics, policy people, regulators, and a consultant who will be joining us via Zoom here at the very end. Quick overview of our panelists. We have Michelle Matson. She is with the Core IWR out of Virginia. She is an ecologist with 25 years of experience as a consultant and a regulator, and she does not like to hear the word no. Anybody who knows her knows that. My next speaker or panelist is Jeremy Sweltenfuss. He is a professor at Colorado State University. He and his grad students focus on improving mitigation standards throughout the country. And he also doesn't like no, but he has a hard time saying no. So if you need something, ask Jeremy. Yes. Next, you have Brian Topping. Brian is with the EPA out of Washington, D.C. He has been working on stream mitigation for a very long time, stream assessments and development, and general regulatory program support. And then finally, Lindsay, who will be joining us via Zoom, Lindsay Tunis. She's with SWCA or SWCA, depending on your persuasion. She's been an ecologist for 20 years, spends most of her time working on coastal ecosystems, and likes holistic functional assessments in her free time. So that sounds like a fun hobby. Like I mentioned, I am Lucy Harrington. I am with GEI Consultants, and really this session is here today, or I'm presenting today, because I'm angry. And that has to do with a site visit I was on 5 years ago, where I had spent all this time coming up with this great performance standard on restoration, on a sandy system, multi-thread. And I went out into the field, and I was so excited to present my child to the world, and I was told no. And I was like, no, because we want to know that this 1 acre of wetland you build on this sandy alluvial system in the plains of Colorado will be here tomorrow, 10 years now, 5 years now, 100 years from now. We want to know that this wetland will be right here where we last saw it. And that just made me really angry. So this is my vendetta. This is my panel presentation to deal with my anger issues. But I really want to have it because I think we're all very smart people here. And I want to hear what your thoughts are. And I hopefully you'll redeem me and be part of my therapy session to get over my anger. So quick overview on how this is going to be run. First, we're going to have some opening remarks to kind of frame this issue a little bit more from each of our panelists, so about 5 to 10 minutes each. But then I want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions from you all. I have some prepared questions, but I'm sure mine are not nearly as interesting as your alls are. But we do have a microphone roaming with Erin back there in the lovely rose-colored sweater. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for her to come to give you a mic so that the others in the virtual room can hear. So yeah, be thinking about those now so that we can have some good discussion at the end. So to start out, I want to talk about framing it from my approach. And my approach is we need to writen how we address performance standards. That might be a made-up word, but I just liked it. So I guess I wanted to take a moment to remind us that mitigation is really restoration. And restoration is to replace functions and values lost in an ecosystem. So what can we do to really make mitigation, i.e. restoration, meaningful on the landscape? We all have this great opportunity to actually implement restoration that is really good for the ecosystem, that's going to be funded, that isn't going to run out of grant funding or change with administrations, more or less, right? So there's an opportunity here to really do something good for the environment that we have the responsibility to do and the power to do. And so, I guess I don't want restoration and performance standards to be a check the box, kind of like 80% native species within this square meter transect sort of thing. I want it to be more, what can we do to improve the system that provides the flood resiliency benefits for our low-income communities, that provides the water fire breaks to prevent wildfires from getting out of control in the West some more, to provide ecological benefits for our species. And so that's really what we have the opportunity to do, and the opportunity to empower ourselves and the regulators to move forward on. So questions that I've thought about in the last 5 years of my angst is, what should we be doing to demonstrate significant lift? Again, not just 3 parameters, we made extra linear feet in this stream. What can we really do to show that the lift that has been done is really benefiting the system? What functions have been lost that should be restored? And how can we restore variability in these systems where things change? I mean, that's just part of nature, and that's just part of the world we live in. So how can we incorporate that variability into making better performance standards? I have a lot of questions. I have many, many more. I hope you all do. But with that, maybe, there we go. I will pass it off to Michelle, and she's going to give an overview from the policy perspective on this issue.
Okay, is this on? Oh, it is on. Nice, thank you. I don't normally need a microphone. For those of you who know me, know that to be true. Okay, so let's see. So yeah, that's a pretty ugly slide, isn't it? Performance-led or process-led performance standards. Now, many of you core regulators have seen these slides that I'm going to present now. I just sort of hit a bunch of them, and it's from our training on performance standards, right? How do we define those? How do we set them? How do we enforce them? And that kind of thing. So it's not going to be new, but it's sort of a way to kind of think about them maybe differently and highlight how much flexibility that we have in the core. I've never thought of my job as a regulator at one point, or even as a consultant, as the core being the hurdle, just really like a partner in trying to figure out what makes sense for the sites that I was trying to restore or provide compensatory mitigation. Okay, so first I just want to show with this graphic how complicated our mitigation process is, right? There are so many steps, and it makes sense because sites, right? Nature is complex. But essentially, this is just our sort of process, right? Our baseline data collection, setting those goals and objectives based on the best available science that we have or reference information, but making sure that those are realistic and in light of constraints that we have in the watershed or that site, and that they're attainable, right? And we move into this setting performance standards, construction, installation, and there's always this adaptive management sort of phase, and multiple phases where hopefully we're learning, right? We're learning because as a restoration practitioner, for much of my career, you never get it right. I mean, I hate to say this, sorry, but you collect as much data as you think you can, or what's reasonable for the site and the money that you have, but you hit groundwater before you know it, or you hit bedrock before you know it, and you have to adjust, and that's during construction. Or you set your performance standards a certain way, and you think, okay, this totally makes sense for the site, and then you're like, oh, you know what? I'm never gonna achieve that because it doesn't occur here, and you adjust. And as a regulator in LA for 5 years, I realized I wasn't the only one making those mistakes, right? And had a site, just as an example, for Camp Pendleton, they used HGM, the hydrogeomorphic functional assessment method, as you guys know, core developed, and performance standards, rightfully so, were based on the variables, which is wonderful. That's definitely how I would want it done. But one of the variables was coarse woody debris. There's no coarse woody debris in this river. So, at one point as a regulator, I'm like, we need to adjust your performance standards because you're never going to achieve it. Anyway, all of that to say that we're always learning, And hopefully those lessons learned come back to either our existing site during long-term management or into designing, permitting our next sites. Oh, I didn't realize that this was, it's so cool. Okay, so I already said all of this, right? This is the core regulators. You are setting first setting your goals, your objectives, your performance standards, and all of these things are related. That is just to say that, again, everything's related. There you go. How's that? Ecological performance standards. Again, that's all we're going to focus on. You guys know that we have administrative performance standards as well, conservation easements, long-term management, funding, protection, and whatnot. We're really just focused on ecological performance standards here. And our rule says that the attributes need to be objective and verifiable, that they're based on the best available science, and that those variables are measures of functional capacity or condition, if possible, right? But there's nothing in there that says they have to be fixed in place, that the transects have to stay in one location, or anything like that, right? So we can think of these things as processes and establish performance standards based on processes. I always put this up that I recommend that in order to not just get it processed, but to make sure from a regulatory perspective that you're really getting as much of the view as you can of the site, that you utilize a suite, or your consultants or your applicants utilize a suite of different monitoring tools, right, which performance standards are based on. And so let me see if I have it, and it's also automated. Okay, so this is EPA's level 3 approach to monitoring, and all this is a way of categorizing monitoring tools, right? So level 1 are these resource inventory maps, so evaluating your site from on Google Earth or whatever, right? Mapping how much acreage you have, what types of habitats potentially, et cetera. Level 2, those are our rapid assessment methods, HGM, CRAM, ORAM, et cetera. And then level 3. And I think that we, as biologists, ecologists, even regulators, are normally focused on this level 3 type of monitoring tool, and that is your transects, your percent cover, soil development, those kinds of things. But when you have more of a suite of monitoring tools, you might get a bigger picture. And so I really rely a lot on level 2 assessment tools to look at overall condition or function, right? But one tool does not give you the answer. So that's, oh, well, yeah, I forgot, it was still, whatever. Okay, so just wanted to give you a couple quick examples that this is nothing new, that districts have learned this lesson. Dr. Steve Edgars, who I'm sure many of you know, in the St. Paul district learned this over many years. He wrote some great guidance in that district, and essentially, determined that we shouldn't be looking for the minimum out of our sites, right? Like you achieve that, that delineate the, the 3 parameters. See, I haven't been in the field in a while. The 3 parameters of a jurisdictional wetland, right? But really, we're looking for the optimum, right? So we should be flexible enough to be looking for the optimum, and why? So the minimum in the past had basically been a failure. He found that, and I'm sure we've all seen this to some respect, that the consultants were, digging the site deeper, if you will, to get more water, to make sure that they achieved that performance standard, and that wasn't really the target wetland type, right? It's not really what the goal was, and so instead they looked to having more flexibility within that, being clearer about the targets and providing a range instead of just meeting those 3 parameters. Here's another example from there. Again, just the only lesson here is providing some flexibility, like being clear within the range, but some flexibility, as well as some alternatives, right? So you're still meeting the requirements that we have of an attribute to be measured, the level that constitutes success and that time period in which it needs to achieve, right? But again, looking more at the process of and variability within a certain wetland target. And also adaptive management. I can harp and harp and harp on adaptive management. Let's have some, even if you don't put it in your performance standards as they do here, but you're always thinking about how, you know, we're doing the best we can, we're minimizing risk, but at the same time, we may need to change course. Here's an example from our colleague here, Jeremy Sultenfuss. He did some wonderful work for the Corps in partnership with the Corps, looked at the academic literature for cattail and wet meadows in Great Plains, and through the analysis identified that there was this range, and I'm sorry, I should tell you what's on here. So water depth here on the x-axis, months on the y, and within that green polygon is the range where this wetland type is considered successful, right? That's the condition and the habitat types that they were shooting for, or not shooting for, but that showed, I don't know, highest condition. And this beige area is sort of that gray area, right? That transition of where the site's, you know, doing well, providing that target habitat, but maybe not, you know, not great. And then the red is where it's just not achieving those performance standards. So can we use this, or those targets, can we use this instead of a fixed performance standard? Sure, right? This is based on reference site information. If you have it, it changes over the course of the year, just like our system functions, et cetera. So I would argue that we could move towards something like this if we have the ability to do so. There's a similar approach, right? Also from Jeremy. And I won't go into details because I'm over my time, but essentially that green line is the variability of water table depth, again, over the months on the y-axis, of a site that is within the target range for this wetland type, for these restored meadows, right? And yet and the red line is one that is not within that range, right? So in this case, maybe a little bit easier to see because it's you know, does not have the hydrology that it needs. Maybe if it was too wet, that might be a little more difficult for us to as regulators, like, go out and see, like, oh, maybe it's not achieving its target. But collecting this data is really valuable if we have that opportunity to do so. And I'm going to leave that there. That's it. Thank you very much. Because this is just a summary, and I'm over my time. Okay, thank you. The policy is so not as fun.
Okay, check. Can you hear me in the back? Great. Okay, I'm Jeremy Sultenfuss. I'm a professor from Fort Collins, Colorado State University. And so let's continue talking about performance-based, process-based performance standards. And let's contrast this to form-based performance standards. Many of us, myself included, have form-based performance standards. Maybe it's stems per acre. And we know that this form of a wetland leads to some function that we're interested in. So I work often in the mountains, and I'm interested in creating these willow communities adjacent to rivers. And I know that if I have overhanging branches, that's the form. If I have overhanging branches, that leads to lower stream temperatures, it leads to habitat. But if I create that form, I don't know if that form is sustainable. I don't know if that form is going to exist in 100 years. We need these sites to be self-sustaining, right? And so it's important to ask, what are the processes that lead to this form existing in the future without continued management? And so in this context, maybe we're interested in processes at larger scales, larger spatial scales, larger temporal scales. So this figure shows on the bottom left, shading, wood recruitment, litter fall. So those are some functions that we're interested in. But those functions, do I have a little pointer? Those functions are promoted by establishment and recruitment of new individuals. They're promoted by succession of different species that follow each other, which itself is a function of maybe larger disturbance processes at a regional scale. So here, maybe fire, or in a lot of my systems, it might be the fluvial dynamics, the disturbance processes associated with rivers. Oh, that didn't go. Hey, go back. Oh, that's supposed to move. There we go. So if I have a river that's doing what rivers do, and it's leading to erosion here, it's leading to deposition there, I know that the form that I'm interested in, those willows, those riparian communities, will perpetuate themselves over time because the disturbance processes associated with that system are working. So it's not just a form-based performance standard I'm interested in of stems per acre, but it's actually the processes that perpetuate that form to exist on the landscape. And when I know that those processes occur, I know that system will perpetuate itself into the future. And there's not one performance standard that we can identify, right, that will be suitable everywhere, because wetlands are really quite variable across the landscape, across our country, across the world. And how we've messed up those wetlands is also quite variable. So how we restore them has to be similarly variable. But how can we establish performance standards that ensure that when we put these systems back together, we've accurately restored them? Come on. So what do we measure? What do we measure to make sure a wetland has been adequately restored? We might know it has a water table, right, within 12 inches or whatever we have to have. It's a 3-parameter. But how do we know if that exact wetland type that we're shooting for has been restored adequately? Well, let's think about conceptually just what is a good indicator? What makes an indicator useful for what you're trying to achieve? Well, good indicators, conceptually, are specific. So they're specific to a certain wetland type, which means they don't occur in other situations. And not only are they specific, but they're faithful, which means that they always occur in the situation that you're interested in. So let's say, just as sort of a sort of trite example, we're interested in determining if this thing in front of me is a human. And one indicator that this thing in front of me is a human is that it breathes oxygen. Is that a good indicator of a human? Well, if I have a frog in front of me, that frog is going to also breathe oxygen, but it doesn't mean it's a human, right? So breathing oxygen is specific, or it's faithful to a human. All humans breathe oxygen. But it's not specific, because lots of things breathe oxygen. So it's kind of a poor indicator. We have to identify what makes a good indicator for our system of interest. Some of you have heard me beat the drum for hydrologic performance standards. I would argue that hydrologic performance standards are this indicator that tells us whether we've established the correct wetland type or not. This hydrograph, months along the x-axis, water table depth along the y-axis, for 3 different wetland types. This is from a project that I work on up in the mountains in Colorado. It's actually within the exact same valley. So it's a big glacial valley. We've got lots of groundwater discharge coming out of the aquifer hillsides, a river going through the middle, and predominantly three wetland types. There's a fen peatland along the margins of the valley where groundwater's coming out. We've got floodplain associated with the river, and then kind of in between we have this wet meadow system. If you as a wetland ecologist work on floodplains, or work on wet meadows, or work on peatlands, you immediately know which line is associated with which. I wouldn't even have to put up the label for you to say like, oh, yep, that is the hydrologic regime of a peatland, of a fen. That's the hydrologic regime of a floodplain. It's pulsing with the river in the early summer months. So this is hydrologic regime. This is specific and faithful to these wetland types. Certainly more specific and more faithful than just one static line that we determine whether something is a wetland, regardless of wetland type, right? Like this one definition of what makes a wetland hydrologically is not specific and it's not faithful. We can do better than that. It also, Michelle mentioned the opportunity for adaptive management. So if we create performance standards based on reference sites, as an example, this is from vernal pools out in California. We have reference pools at the top, and we have restored pools along the bottom. We can use the signature, if you will, of those reference sites to determine what these pools should look like, should function, what processes, hydrologic processes, should occur within that given year. And we can very rapidly determine which ones aren't quite living up to what we expect them to be. Sometimes these pools might fill up a little quicker than we would expect and dry out a little sooner. So there's something weird going on with the contributing area for that pool. And maybe that clay layer underneath the vernal pool is cracked and it's draining quite rapidly. If we did not have the reference pools to compare that to, you might say like, well, it's filling up, it's fine. Because we have something to compare it to, because we have a performance standard that is specific and faithful, not only to that wetland type, but to that wetland type in that exact landscape position, we know that there's a couple pools that are not functioning how they should. And you're not meant to read this, but this is just to say that we should be measuring lots of stuff too. I'm never going to suggest that we only measure hydrology and check the box and that's fine. We should do our 3 parameters, but we should also have performance standards that are specific to what we're trying to restore in terms of some of those anthropogenic stressors, making sure that we're recovering that site from those anthropogenic stressors. Some dependent variables of your site and your wetland of interest, whether that's, I don't know, I won't even off the top of my head come up with something, but specific to what you're trying to restore. We should have performance standards that are specific. I don't know, I was talking with a gentleman yesterday from Florida, and we were talking about a mangrove bank and how some of their performance standards look at what the tidal influence should be in their bank, and they have performance standards specific to that, which is so cool, and that's so good, because that performance standard is specific to that mangrove system. And if that process is occurring, the mangroves will probably continue to occur on their own into the future. And that's really what we're going for. You might have performance standards that are form-based and that tell you that you've created the system right now as what it should be. But without process-based performance standards, you don't know if that site will maintain itself through time. So process-based indicators might be more helpful than form-based, I would argue. Certainly provides more adaptive management opportunities. If you see your performance standard not being met and your performance standard is based on a process, you can identify the mechanism that leads to that process and identify maybe some adaptive management opportunities sooner than you would maybe if you start seeing some of your stems die in year 5. Indicators should be specific and faithful, as I said. And of course, we need to think about indicators that are meaningful. You all have limited time, limited resources. You should not measure everything. You should only measure what's important. I think that's it.
Thank you. I'm Brian Topping, and I'm actually not going to talk as much about the regulatory, but about streams as one of those areas. So Jeremy and Michelle both covered wetlands examples, and I want to talk about restoration of dynamic stream systems. Well, every stream should be dynamic. It's always some erosion, deposition, and features. But when I'm talking about dynamic, I mean systems that change in the number of channels between monitoring, during the monitoring period. Systems that are changing and being driven by the biota, possibly, in their form over time. And so that you don't have a fixed transect that you expect to stay for the full course of the monitoring period. And if you don't have that because it's a stream wetland complex or because there's active beaver in the system that may or may not be building dams, that may or may not be surviving throughout your monitoring period, what do you monitor to show that it's still successful? And ask the most extremes, stage 0 restoration projects, just some of the examples, valley restoration approach. So when we talk about restoration of dynamic stream systems, we've seen the practices in the restoration community grow, and we've heard a lot of talk about it in the mitigation practices as well, and some of the frustrations. And so how do we get there to make it acceptable risk tolerance for mitigation? Because mitigation is about, from a regulatory perspective, the risk we're willing to take with the impacts that we know are going to happen. We need to offset those impacts that we know are going to happen and be permanent on the landscape. And so it's managing our risk with what we hope to happen in the restoration side. And what we've seen is that traditional mitigation evaluations often are discouraging changing systems. And so how do we alleviate that risk aversion to encourage restoration of these highly productive and valuable systems? And so we might need some new frameworks for that. And so when we talk about restoration design implementation, there's hurdles there as well, because these approaches are new in some respects. And definitely when you talk about being applied to a mitigation context, they may be being put into very new settings. So we're not necessarily going to say it's a stage 0 restoration in the middle of a huge Forest Service tract. What about if you're trying to do it with private property in smaller tracts? Is it possible? Where does this work? Where is enough space? There's a lot of hurdles for the practitioners to work through. And how do we make these resilient? How do we show that they're going to be resilient to upstream changes in hydrology and hydraulics, sediment load, in water quality, in land use? How are they going to be resilient to downstream changes when they decide to put in a bottomless culvert downstream of your project and your base level is no longer protected? And so we need to make sure that these dynamic systems that we expect to change and we want to change because that's how they produce so much more for us ecologically, but how do we make sure that they are still going to be resilient in the context in which we're forcing them or placing them? Regulatory hurdles, we have plenty. We all have our own demons to work with. What do we monitor? If I don't have a cross-section to check, what do I go out and check? How do I know that this is a dynamic, healthy system versus it's unraveling? So Jeremy's example of having those references is great, and for hydrology and wetlands and having that reference is great. We might not have many, if any, good reference systems to pull from for some of these systems in some of these areas. Mill dam restorations in the east are growing in popularity and occurring more. Legacy sediment removal and stream wetland complexes, but we still don't have a lot of good references. There's projects out there that have restored stream wetland complex, and the index of biological integrity for the macroinvertebrate community in year 1 was higher than the state reference. It was better biological community than anywhere else in the state they had monitored. They are performing, but where do we find our references? So how do we know what's working and what's dynamic versus unraveling? What to do with beaver? What do we do when beaver move onto a site that wasn't designed to have beaver? May build dams. Beaver is not a permanent situation. Beaver may come, reside for years, for a short while, and then leave, or they may come for decades. And what do we do? And how do we not simply remove and pretend that they're not going to come back until at least we get to long-term management and we're not going to deal with it anymore? How do we address and say, okay, beaver came to this site. Are there alternative approaches now? Are there alternative performance standards we can focus on that we can say they can stay, and this is what we need to look at to see that it's still a healthy site, and if the beaver leave and eventually the dams breach, this site won't fully unravel. What do you do with the credits? How do we adjust what we're doing when it's a dynamic system if beaver come in and change the system? It's still a fluvial system. Beaver don't change it to be just wetlands. It's still a stream system there, but what do we do with the credits for that? And how do we work through those issues? There's going to be a lot of trade-offs. There are some approaches, low-tech, beaver dam analog, post-assisted driven systems that can be done that might work in certain situations and be much, much cheaper to install than heavy equipment, rock and material, and intensive plantings. But the initial monitoring assessment may be more. The time till you meet performance standards may be much longer. The intensity of the monitoring to show you're meeting them may involve more things. So there are going to be trade-offs. And there's also going to be the uncertainty. Because as the industry learns to use these practices, the regulators, going to be managing our risk and working through it with you to figure out what we're comfortable with. And so your performance standards and what all works, we're not going to know. We're not going to be as predictable. You're not going to have that project history to know, yeah, I should be able to get a credit release based on my performance at this time period or at the next time period. So they may need more time to develop. We want to hear from you. Sam, right there, just joined us at EPA and is doing a research project focusing on these dynamic stream systems. We want your ideas, what we can measure, how to do it, approaches. We want to hear about your experiences. So please come find Sam, myself, email us anytime. We want to talk because we want to help put the tools in place so that regulators can feel comfortable when presented with a project like this of, okay, here's some ideas I can look at for monitoring. Here's some performance standards potentially that could work. Here's how we can address adaptive management. So we want to get some ideas out there and give some resources for folks to work with. So we want to hear from you to get those and evaluate those. So thank you very much.
We're going to switch over to some tech here real quick, so hopefully this works. Lindsay, can you hear us? Lindsay, we can't hear you.
Now we can.
I think I can hear you groaning.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, there was a delay. Okay, let me figure out which order I share my screen. So I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you guys, but I'm glad I was able to at least do this virtually. This is a topic that I am continue to always be excited about. Are you guys seeing my screen okay, Lucy?
Yep, you're perfect.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's very kind of you. So I'm here to talk a little bit as a consultant, but regardless of whether I was a consultant, a regulator, or a banker, at the heart of things, I'm always a restoration ecologist. And even further than that, at the heart of things, I'm an ecologist. I happen to do restoration, but ecology is my language and always has been, and I love it. So what I want to do is share a couple kind of big picture concepts that as a consultant, and I think that many banking firms that do their own design work are likely going through many of these same processes. So note that this is not always consultant specific. So first point is natural variability exists in our systems, both in space and time. So what this image is showing on the screen from left to right is moving from kind of transitional upland in a coastal estuarine system down to high marsh, mid marsh, and then low marsh, and even subtidal on the far right. So in this one location in a single cross section, you cross a significant amount of variability with very little amount of change in the surface elevation, because all of these kind of microhabitats are driven by their preferred inundation period with the ocean. So this is big picture there. Continuing with that concept, I forgot to say, I also am a fan of coastal systems, so wanted to make sure we brought some of that into this conversation. This isn't specifically unique to riverine systems. Most of our systems are dynamic in some form or another and at different scales. So this is another illustration of variability in space and time, and this is showing eelgrass distribution in San Diego Bay. So there's two things I wanted to point out. One, there's the image on the right, and you can see there's contiguous beds, eelgrass beds, and then there's also really small patchy beds. And that's what you could see on any given point in time. But then if you look at the graph, we have year along the x-axis and the total acres within San Diego Bay. And then each of those colors represents a region within San Diego Bay, starting at the mouth of San Diego Bay and working all the way to the south, which we would call the Back Bay. So the place that has least connection to the exchange of true ocean water. And so what you can see here is that over the course of almost 20 years, the total acreage within San Diego Bay changes, and the total acreage within each of those zones change. So we have, for example, I'll look at the purple, that's the south, so very Back Bay. We move from just over 1,000 to almost 1,250, back down to 700, and kind of bounce up and down over the course of those 20 years. And then we see the opposite kind of pattern at the outer bay. So this is actually outside of the mouth. We see really low amount in 1999, a significant increase in 2004, and then a slow drop up as we move to 2017. So how much of this is truly natural variability and how much of it is being driven by other anthropogenic effects? That's a more complicated story, which actually adds to this conversation because that's what we all have to face. So I wanted to, this is a kind of key word that I try to keep in my mind, the difference between disturbance and stressor. So ecological disturbance are natural phenomena that include fires, landslides, flooding, windstorms, insects, pests, whereas a stressor is caused by human and or associated activities that negatively impact the condition. And so you can think of this like pollution, water pollution, trash, cutting down material trespassing. But the most important thing is that both these disturbances and these stressors now interact with each other, often in very significant ways. So the image on the right is showing boar beetle, and boar beetle is the devastation to many, forests from various pests over the last decade is thought to be attributed to ongoing drought conditions that resulted in the trees becoming stressed to the point where what was once kind of a background bug could really take off. And, just in that sentence alone, I said drought, tree stress, a pest, and, couple that with the other stressors that are facing our ecosystems, it's not surprising that they would become more susceptible, like your immune system. So what I wanted to show here is how that natural variability and stressor is still playing a part in all the decisions we need to make. So this is a schematic very similar to the photograph that I showed in the beginning. On the right-hand side, we're in the uplands. As we continue to move toward the left, we move into the marsh habitat, going from high marsh to mid-marsh to low marsh to mudflat to vegetated subtidal. And you can see that there's kind of key ranges at each transition color, and these are their preferred elevations. So we're talking about, for example, I'm gonna look at mid-marsh. Mid-marsh occurs between 125 centimeters and 175 centimeters. We're talking about a 50 centimeter band where this preferred habitat, where this habitat is prefers. And as soon as something changes, it will have to, either migrate up or migrate down in elevation. And each one of these zones has a different suite of species which are tolerant to the various inundation periods. And many of them support wildlife that have developed over time for those same constraints. So that's what the top image is showing. So if we look at the bottom image, we now have that same exact cross section, but we've now put the various sea level rise scenarios on top. And so what we can look at, let's look at mid-marsh again. So mid-marsh, if you look in the top image, really didn't have water sitting on top of it on average. And now, if I can stare at there is, let's see, to my math, there is almost 100 additional centimeters of water sitting on top of it in the worst case scenario. And as I just said, this range is specific to these plants. And so adding 100 centimeters of water means that this plant needs to move upslope. And at the same time, every one of these habitats needs to move upslope, including the eelgrass. So although seagrass, eelgrass is a subtidal system, it also has a very narrow band where it's happy. And so you can imagine that over time, all these habitats are going to get squished into some space. And so the purpose of this illustration is really to show that we have to deal with dynamic systems in their current condition, and we have to be dealing with dynamic systems as new stressors continue to come into the site. Sea level rise may be more predictable than something like a new invasive species, but we know at some point something is going to come into our system and add stress that could result in a change in condition. Okay, why is it not working? Okay, so resilient ecosystems. So supporting diversity at multiple levels. Resilient ecosystems support diversity at multiple levels, including habitat diversity, traits, function, genetic, and species diversity. And I'm sure there's many more we could add. So if our natural systems work best when they are dynamic and provide the most diversity when they are dynamic and diversity of services, how do we build dynamic systems into our mitigation design, crediting, monitoring, and overall success standards? And I think one of the kind of key points is that single metric measures of design and success have been shown to yield reduced condition. So there was a study done to illustrate this further in 2004 in California with the California Regional Board looking at a series of permits to see how these projects complied with their permit conditions and how they functioned ecologically post-restoration compared to the impact site. So they looked at 204 mitigation sites throughout the state. They reviewed the permits for compliance, and then they evaluated condition using the early version of the California Rapid Assessment Method, which is a level 2 with, Michelle showed the EPA framework. It's a level 2 monitoring assessment, takes a few hours to complete one assessment, looks at the wetland from large scale landscape all the way down to structure and biotic structure on site. So, and what they found is that, so each one of these bars represents a different permit constraint. So we have acreage, very common. We have 401 conditions. This could be, a whole slew of kind of mishmash metrics. We have mitigation plan conditions. This might be where we see like 80% cover or, X number of, a wide variety. And then we have the condition score on the far right. And what you can see when looking at this graph is the majority of the projects met their acreage, 401 conditions, and mitigation plan requirements. But they all had a lower conditions, not all, that was too big of a statement. A lot of them had a reduced wetland condition score compared to the impact site. So going back to what Lucy was saying about, we have an opportunity to do good work, but if good work isn't monitored properly and isn't measured properly, we can wind up ultimately not meeting our goals of no net loss of functions and values and or replacing those conditions that are lost through impacts. So this is a great document and I would highly encourage reading it in general. I think it's really interesting. So are we restoring for now or later or both? So I would say restoring for now. Michelle would say this too, because we talked about this yesterday, but we're restoring for now by building resilient systems and planning to bring in adaptive management at various timelines. And if we're using process-based design, monitoring, and success standards, we should be able to document that kind of design. Okay, so I wanted to very quickly just point out that performance standards do not have to be black and white. And I really appreciated how the other presenters already mentioned that having multiple measurements of performance standards is really important. And it's important as the manager of the site, as the restoration ecologist, and it's important for the system itself. So this is anything from container plant survival to quantitative veg transects to geomorphology, bioassessments. And so what's on the screen right now is actually a proposed monitoring timeline for a project that's currently going through the approval process. And the other thing I want to point out is that there are 8 years shown here. So given that this project is in Southern California, we have extended periods of drought. Our reoccurrence interval for certain rain events is continuing to get farther and farther apart. And so pushing for a 5-year monitoring plan and success is more likely to set us up for failure, set up the banking the banking lead for failure. So what we've done is we've made an 8-year plan, and we've softened the monitoring on the front end. So for example, quantitative transects are going to be done, that's vegetation, is going to be done in year 2 and year 4, and then what we refer to as the final year, with the idea that depending on what type of environmental conditions we have, that still could happen at 5, but we wouldn't automatically do that monitoring unless we had other indicators that success was being met. So those were the kind of 2 points, lots of tools and potentially acknowledging an extended amount of time and reducing some of the front end risk. Okay, once again, there are ways that you can display success standards that are not simply greater than or equal than 80. And I think that there can be a lot of powerful tools out there. What I'm showing you now is an illustration of the California Rapid Assessment Score for year 1 and year 4. The red is year 1, the blue is year 4. And this is just put on a number graph with basically the 3 main condition classes for the wetland assessment score. So you can look at, for example, hydrology, nothing much has changed in 4 years, and it's sitting at the high end of fair. Whereas the, physical structure was a lower scoring in the first year and continued to move up almost into the good category. So this is a way of conveying data in more than just a simple black and white way. And I'm just going to show you 2 more, and I'm not going to talk a lot about these. So this is a habitat development curve. And I think Jeremy's presentation drives home this point that one of the best ways that we can monitor our sites is understanding baseline conditions of our watersheds, our reference sites. So this is showing a curve for restored projects in estuary systems in California. And it's showing you a different variety of ages. So very young restoration sites on the far left, much older restoration sites on the far right. And if you see the curve, one of the things it points out is that it takes a long time for sites to continue to move up into higher quality conditions. So a 5-year monitoring program, you could easily set yourself up for failure if you don't understand how long it takes for some of these sites to get to meeting their condition. But the other thing you can do is plot your points and see if they're on or above the curve. So anytime they're above the curve, they're actually pulling the curve up and meeting it. If they're on the curve, same concept. If they were below the curve, that could trigger adaptive management. So this is another visual tool. And then finally, this is, hopefully you guys can't hear that from your beeping. This is an illustration of the overall score, once again using condition, but you can use these kinds of graphs for really anything. And it's showing the basically the cumulative distribution of sites and at the 50th percentile range. So anything going above, for example, the 73 means you're shifting the curve farther to the right, improving overall wetland condition for your system. But when you look at year 1 and 4, you see that it's on the curve. And what you'd hope to see is that it continues to move up the curve over time. Oh my gosh, this is horrible. And that is that for me. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lucy to wrap us up.
Is this on still? Okay, good. So Lindsay, if you could stop sharing your screen, and then in the back tech folks, if you could put on that original presentation that has all of our emails. Keep going, one more. There you go. Okay, so we only have 15 minutes because we all are very passionate about this topic, but I am going to turn it over to all of you now and really, really hope you guys have questions. And before I lose you completely, this group that is talking today, we're really trying to push this conversation forward at the federal level. And so if you would like to be part of this effort, part of this group, kind of like in the way public lands are being pushed forward, please email anybody on this list and we'll start trying to plan a quarterly check-in and see how we can push improved performance standards forward in the regulatory context. So anyone raise your hand? We got Laura right there. She's going to start walking around.
Michelle, this is kind of a follow-up to yours. So you mentioned a range for the performance standards from some low to some high. And the one thing well, probably lots of things I've struggled with, but one of those things is defining the expected range within that low to high. I mean, it's not necessarily hard to set a range, but describing the expected distribution, because obviously you don't want everything on the driest end, the wettest end, the one plant species, whatever.
Yeah, I agree. Defining that range it can be difficult if you are in an area where you don't have a statewide database, for example, that has some of that data that you can pull, like Lindsay can with CRAM now. But 15 years ago, that wasn't available. So I think there are more opportunities now than there used to be for a range. Certainly, when I started out, there were hardly any reference sites in the region that I worked. And what we did was have to sort of develop our reference range, right? And but we had the ability and the funding to do that in a large SAMP effort. SAMP is kind of a bad word now, but the Special Area Management Plan efforts that were going on at the time in Southern California. So for San Juan, San Mateo SAMP, for example, we did a study on vernal pools and a study on slope wetlands, and there were obviously no reference sites for those. So we had to go identify all the ones that we could within, this region, sample them, and do some statistics to figure out sort of like what was the range for the sites that were showing the either habitat type or condition that we wanted, right? That's, I understand, is unusual. That was a highly funded, large watershed-based efforts, both that and Otay River and the San Diego River. But I do think that now we have there's more of that data available, right? I mean, I used to have to draw my delineations in the field on a topographic map. Don't have to do that anymore. I used to have to use planimeters to get my acreage. Don't have to do that anymore. So I do think it's a little bit easier now to set that range, Tom.
So much because you likely know what range you'd like to see once it's all developed. How do you express that range in a performance standard? How do you verbalize, write something that captures the distribution in a way that it's measurable?
You can't, so I'm sorry, I might not be understanding, but I'm like between 12 and 20 inches of surface water over a certain amount of time, right? So it still has to be specific.
So how many do you want between 12 and 14? How many do you want between 14 and 16, and so on? Or is it fine if they're all between 10 and 12?
Exactly. So you want to identify that ideal range, and I think that Jeremy's graphic that I showed that showed that red sort of depending on the time of year, that range of groundwater depths and surface water depths that still produce that ideal habitat type. That's your range, right? So anything within there, our assumption or our observation is that it's achieving, it's in good condition, it's achieving essentially our performance standards. Yeah, you're probably better at describing this.
I don't think I'm better, but in addition to everything that I agree with that you said, I think it also just depends on this, like how specific you're trying to be in terms of, are you trying to be specific to a plant community, in which case it would be a pretty fine margin? Are you trying to be specific to just like generally kind of here's a marsh, shallow marsh to deep marsh? That could be kind of a broader performance standard, and hopefully that can be a conversation between you and the core individual. But I also wanted to mention, and I see you wanting to ask a follow-up, but I also want to mention that I think it would be neat if we were a bit creative in how we approach reference data sets. So when I say reference, I do not mean HGM reference condition. A few of those exist across our landscape, certainly where we're doing our mitigation projects. I mean a suitable comparison of what you're trying to create. Yes. And like just a comparison site. Maybe the veg is hosed for some site constraint, but the hydrology is intact. So if you're doing a hydrologic performance standard and you have intact hydrology, you can use that site if it's suitably like kind of what you're going for. So think broader in terms of what a reference site might look like. But I would also encourage us all to use our existing data. You all spend so much time and money going out and monitoring these sites. You actually have quite robust data sets to show the trajectory of your restoration sites that themselves could be used as your reference data sets. So if you compare some new restoration project and you use data from some site that you can argue turned out awesome, that kind of could be your reference data set that you use. It doesn't have to be some, like national park or pristine landscape, right? It's like a mitigation bank maybe that has been deemed to be successful could be your reference.
No, I think, and again, even, I guess maybe I'm not being, it's something even way more basic than that. So if you set your range and you know what your reference looks like and it expresses a broad range, and you say, okay, it should to some degree look like this range. We set the range between 7 and 10 or 7 and 15 or whatever. Are you happy if everything's 7 or 15?
I mean, as an ecologist, I don't think homogeneity is something we should be pursuing. Right. So I think variability is great, but if you happen to have the same number, it'd be hard to, we should say like, that's not ideal, but you met your performance standard. So,
right, but do we want a set of performance standards that even though we've taken the next step beyond barely tripping over the wetland definition, to saying, okay, this range that captures our reference site here, and that's all good, but at the end of the day, it's all barely tripping over the wetland definition because it's all at the bottom of the range. So
I mean, my response to that would be, if it's at 7 for a few years and then it's at 15 for a year and then it goes down to 7. I mean, I personally don't see a problem with things jumping around within that variability scale. Like if it's a 7 forever and ever and ever, yeah, you have some issue because you're not incorporating the variability. You're incorporating I'm a C average, right? But if you're a C and then an A and then a B and then an A and then a C, I mean, to me, that's variability. That's the system functioning to me.
Next question.
So I had a question that Tom actually touched upon, and it's more of the approach with the regulatory side of approvals. I think oftentimes the bank sponsor and the IRT are in agreement of where the project is supposed to be aiming for, and when we're talking about these variable standards, it's trying to come up with the risk tolerance. So it's, can you move a little bit higher or a little bit lower, and what's going to be acceptable? But then what Tom's getting at is, from the IRT standpoint, they don't want to see it as an excuse for underperformance or everything being driven. And so what we get in is conflict, not about should we have performance variability, but the risk component of it that the agencies are willing to accept by setting that standard. So I'm wondering, from the regulatory standpoint, can you talk, and maybe it gets a little bit to what Tom was questioning, we're not trying to get everything driven towards the extremes, but how do you add enough comfort level with that range moving that some of those things may end up occurring?
I don't know.
Lucy, can I chime in?
Well, maybe I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it's a narrower band within that optimal. Originally we had set this up as a discussion. We don't have all the answers, but maybe it is a narrower band within that optimal range, if we want to, or it's a percentage. I think if it's like, for example, a vernal pool restoration project, it's unlikely that all the vernal pools are going to be at one level. Like you saw the graph that Jeremy showed of the reference site data. How many lines were in there? I don't know how far they were all apart, right? But that was data from all vernal pools, or from this whole set of vernal pools, and none of them looked exactly alike, right? So if you're restoring vernal pools, for example, it can't be done very well. You're gonna have a range in there. So I'm not sure that I don't have an answer because I don't know, but maybe a narrow range.
I
I
also,
don't want to fail
I
that.
also think, just for a second, is it's getting us closer. And so we learn from that, and it might not be the same standard. It might be that a different standard needs to adjust, which gets us closer to the optimal. And so it's not all optimal on one standard. It's optimal at how these standards fit together, too. And so I think, we're getting better as an industry. We're getting better results in mitigation. We're going to continue. We've still got a long way to go incrementally better and learn.
Hey, Lucy, can I chime in?
Yep.
Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, so I think one of the points of this presentation that I think about is that I think one of the risks of these black and white success standards is that we then start designing sites to those success standards, as opposed to starting with, we're going to build a holistic ecosystem process. Yeah, my face isn't on. A holistic ecosystem, we're going to restore this ecosystem, including, wetlands, floodplain, buffer, seasonal wetlands, the whole piece. We're going to first do a good job designing a restoration project, and then we're going to look at the jurisdictional limits, or predict the jurisdictional limits. But then we're going to look at success standards that prove that we built an ecologically viable system. And one of the things, I think Jeremy's presentation showed it, and I think mine had as well, is there were multiple, measurements showing confidence intervals. So doing good monitoring design and replication, and for all of our projects, we do power analysis to see if we need to increase sample size or decrease sample size to capture the variability. And you can do that same thing for your reference conditions. And I forgot what Jeremy said, but I'm really glad he made that point, that reference doesn't mean the best in the watershed. It means reference for your site. What do you think your site could achieve? So I don't know that I'm making total sense, but I think that there's kind of a mixed answer. And as Michelle said, we don't have the answers, but we think it's critical to solve this because we're often restoring systems to lower conditions than the impact site. So if anything, this is meant to be kind of a red flag, and let's help and talk about this more.
And I don't want to dismiss that question though, too,
No, I
because
don't
I think as ecologists, we all can appreciate the role of processes in maintaining and in the restoration project. The trick in this what we're trying to promote though, is communicating that to the regulator, because when we're talking about processes, there's some uncertainty associated with that. And you as a business owner, uncertainty equals risk. And so why would you do something that's thought to be risky if you don't have some assurance from the regulator that they're completely on board? And so I think that is a really, really valid question.
Adaptive management. Oh, sorry. Oh, we gotta go.
Apparently, it's time to leave. I don't have a microphone, so I'm going to talk loudly. But I'm sorry we didn't have a longer, oh, there we go. I'm sorry we didn't have a longer discussion, but please find any of us or email any of us, and we would love to keep this conversation going, probably in like a quarterly Zoom meeting. We all love those, but or send examples, yeah, because we'd love to get the participation to keep this going. So thank you all for coming, and I guess enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.